Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today. I want to take some time to walk you through a major political story that's been getting a lot of attention in the United States, but also one that has exposed something deeper happening inside the American conservative movement. Over the past year, as the second Trump administration moves through its first full year, the American right has been going through one of the most visible and intense internal shakeups in decades. And I want to talk about what exactly is happening, why it's happening now, and what it might mean for the country going forward. To make things really clear from the start, I'm not here to argue for one faction or another. What I want is to lay out the landscape in a way that's calm, factual, and easy to follow. The American right has always been a coalition, meaning it's made up of groups with different priorities, different ideologies, and different styles of leadership. Sometimes the coalition works smoothly, sometimes it doesn't, and right now, it's definitely not. So in this video, I'm going to explain the four main areas where these fractures are showing up most clearly: foreign policy, domestic politics, media and ideology, and leadership within the movement. And I'll also talk about why J.D. Vance, the current vice president, has suddenly become a central figure in this moment. By the end, you'll have a clearer sense of what's happening, why the American right is fighting with itself, and what lessons history might offer for navigating this period. Let's start with foreign policy, because that's actually where some of the biggest disagreements have exploded into public view. Inside the conservative movement today, there are two major camps that have been clashing hard. On one side are the non-interventionists, people who believe the United States should scale back military involvement overseas, question its long-standing alliances, and avoid getting dragged into foreign conflicts. This group is skeptical of America's close relationship with Israel, and even more skeptical about any form of nation-building or large-scale military commitments abroad. On the other side are the neo-conservatives, often associated with a more hawkish, strong defense approach. They believe the U.S. should play an active role in countering adversaries like Iran, supporting allies, and shaping international outcomes. For them, stepping back from global leadership actually makes the world more dangerous and unstable. Normally, these disagreements exist but don't dominate the political conversation. But in the past year, they've become impossible to ignore. Each side accuses the other of endangering U.S. interests. Neocons say non-interventionists are abandoning allies. Non-interventionists say hawks want endless wars. And because both camps have large followings, both in Congress and in conservative media, these debates have become very personal and very public. For everyday conservative voters, it's confusing and honestly exhausting. When the same political camp starts arguing over basic questions, like whether America should support Israel, whether it should keep troops in certain regions, or whether it should intervene if allies are attacked, it becomes extremely hard for the Republican Party to present one unified voice. And that lack of unity becomes an issue, not just in foreign policy, but in every area where the movement tries to govern. Now let's turn to domestic politics, because the divisions here are just as intense and in some ways even more complicated. Within the U.S. conservative movement, there are at least three different groups that have been clashing with each other. First are the traditional Republican establishment figures, people who care about institutional stability, predictable governance, and keeping the movement away from extreme or fringe ideas. Then there are the populist conservatives, who are more willing to challenge established institutions, question mainstream media, and embrace more provocative voices who speak directly to grassroots audiences. And finally, there are the outright fringe or extremist elements, groups or influencers who push conspiracy theories, use inflammatory rhetoric, or adopt positions that most Americans consider far outside the political mainstream. And these groups are not getting along. One major flashpoint has been Tucker Carlson, one of the most influential conservative media personalities of the past decade. When he gave a platform to Fuentes, a highly controversial figure, known for extremist views, it caused a huge backlash. Many traditional conservatives were furious. They argued that giving that kind of exposure to someone with such a toxic reputation hurts the entire movement. But at the same time, Carlson has a massive following, and criticizing him risks alienating his audience, so the conservative movement found itself stuck, unable to fully condemn the behavior, but also unable to endorse it. Another big dispute came when several well-known conservative members of Congress publicly criticized Trump for not releasing documents related to Jeffrey Epstein. That kind of open disagreement within the party leadership is unusual, and it made the internal tensions even more visible. Then there's Candace Owens, another high-profile commentator whose controversial claims and conspiracy-tinged commentary have drawn huge online audiences. Many younger conservatives follow her, but mainstream conservatives find her messaging reckless or irresponsible. And that divide between older establishment Republicans who still rely on traditional media and younger conservatives who get information almost entirely from online influencers has become one of the biggest generational splits inside the right. And it doesn't stop there. Even conservative institutions, think tanks, academic organizations, activist networks have become battlegrounds. Different factions have tried to push these organizations in dramatically different ideological directions. Some want more populism. Some want more nationalism. Others want a return to traditional small government conservatism. None of these groups have the power to completely dominate the others, which means the result is constant fighting. You can think of it this way. For the past decade, the American right has kept expanding its coalition, adding new voices, new personalities, new media platforms, and new ideological camps. But what it hasn't done is create any structure strong enough to coordinate all of them. So instead of unity, there's chaos. This brings us to the next part of the story: leadership, or more accurately, the absence of leadership. What makes this moment especially unstable is that President Trump is not someone who typically tries to mediate disagreements within the movement. His political power doesn't come from think tanks or party elders or traditional conservative institutions. It comes from his direct connection with his supporters. He talks to them through rallies, social media, and direct communication. He bypasses the traditional gatekeepers who once helped keep the conservative movement aligned. That strategy worked very well for him for years, but it also meant that when different factions started fighting with each other, there was no one positioned or willing to step in and calm things down. For a long time, one person did manage to play that mediating role: Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA. He had strong ties with young conservatives, mainstream conservative leaders, donors, and many of the movement's different ideological groups. Whether people liked him or not, he did serve as one of the few bridges between the competing factions. But after his assassination in September, a shocking and destabilizing event, the conservative movement suddenly realized just how important his role had been. His absence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped nobody, at least not immediately. Different factions began claiming more territory. Rivalries sharpened. Each group believed it had the best strategy for shaping the future of the movement, but none of them had enough influence to unify the rest. That's where J.D. Vance enters the picture. Vance is one of the few figures in the conservative movement today who has credibility across multiple factions. He's trusted by the populist base because he presents himself as someone who understands working-class America and speaks directly to its concerns. He's recognized by traditional conservatives as someone intelligent, articulate, and capable of engaging with policy in a serious way. And because he's relatively young compared to the typical senior Republican leadership, he appeals to younger conservatives who don't feel represented by the older GOP establishment. In other words, he occupies a very rare political position. He's someone who can speak to almost every part of the conservative coalition without immediately triggering the others. But with that position comes pressure. Right now, Vance is being pulled from all sides. Each faction wants him to take its side. Some demand that he condemn extremist influencers. Others demand that he reject establishment groups. Some want him to break with neo-conservatives. Others want him to distance himself from anti-interventionists. Everyone is waiting to see what he will do, because they believe he could be the one to set the tone for the movement's future. This isn't the first time something like this has happened in American politics. Before Nixon became president, he faced a very similar situation: a conservative movement divided between mainstream Republicans, anti-communist hardliners, and more extremist groups like the John Birch Society. At first, Nixon tried denouncing the extremist groups directly, and it backfired. He alienated a big portion of the conservative grassroots and ended up losing the California governor's race. But later, he changed strategies. Instead of attacking fringe groups head-on, he kept a careful distance from them, while still appealing to their broader audience on key issues, things like anti-communism and law and order. That approach allowed him to reunify the right enough to win the presidency in 1968, and then win 49 states in 1972. The idea here isn't that Vance is Nixon, or that today's political environment is the same as the 1960s, but the comparison illustrates something important. Political coalitions don't survive by trying to please everyone equally. They survive when they identify which segments of the coalition are essential and which ones need to be carefully kept at arm's length to avoid damaging the movement's broader appeal. And that's the challenge Vance now faces. He has to figure out how to keep the conservative coalition big enough to win national elections without allowing fringe elements to define its public image. If he leans too far toward the populist side, moderates and independents might walk away. If he leans too far toward the establishment, the party's grassroots could revolt. And if he spends too much time trying to avoid taking sides, he risks letting the divisions widen until they can't be repaired. What's clear is that the next few years will be a major test of whether the Republican coalition can be held together, or whether it continues to fracture into rival camps that no longer share a common political direction. And that's really the core message of this whole story. The American right is at a crossroads. Foreign policy disagreements, domestic political fights, media fragmentation, and leadership gaps have all converged at the same time. Some of this pressure comes from real ideological differences. Some comes from generational change. Some comes from the rise of new media ecosystems that operate independently of traditional institutions. And some comes from the fact that conservative politics today includes more personalities, more influencers, and more competing visions than at any time in recent memory. Whether the movement continues to fracture or finds a way to rebuild unity will shape not just internal Republican politics, but the direction of American politics as a whole. For now, the one thing that seems certain is that the conflicts aren't going away. They'll likely intensify. And the people who step up to navigate this moment will play an outsized role in shaping what comes next. Thanks for watching, and if you want more clear, in-depth breakdowns of complex political stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next video.